Сайн байцгаана уу хүн төлөгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн дефакто ярилцлагын зочноор Их Британи, Умард Ирландын нэгдсэн хаант улсын болон цог жавхлант хааны онц бөгөөд бүрэн эрхт элчин сайд ноён Филип, Малон оролцож байна.
Филип, Малон Их Британи, Умард Ирландын нэгдсэн хаант улсаас Монгол Улсад суугаа онц бөгөөд бүрэн эрхт элчин сайд. Британи Open University-д бизнесийн удирдлагын мэргэжлэр суралцаж төгссөн. Гадаад харилцаа хамтын нөхөрлөл хөгжлийн яамд аttaché, парламентын асуудал хариулсан туслах ажилтан газрын дарга, Гватемала дахь Британи элчин сайдын яамд 3 дугаар нарийн бичгийн дарга, Люксембург дахь Британи элчин сайдын яамд худалдааны 3 дугаар нарийн бичгийн дарга, бүгд найрам дахь Литв улс дахь бүрэн эрхт элчин сайдаар тус ажиллаж байсан. 2018 оноос эхлэн Монгол улс дахь Их Британи, Умард Ирландын нэгдсэн хаант улсаас Монгол улсад суугаа онц бөгөөд бүрэн эрхт элчин сайдаар ажиллаж байна.
Хамбогд уус хатан туулгын хөвөөндөх цэнгэг агаартай бүсэд байрлалтай. Хүүхдэд ээлтэй хотхны төлөвлөлт болон эрүүл амьдралын хэм маягийг эрхэмлэгч та бүхнийг King Tower апартментийн 5 дугаар элчин орон сууцнд урьж байна. Амар тайван амьдрал, аян давтагдшгүй өнгөтэй. Сэлгэр уужим орон зай, хараа баясгах, үзэмжид харууц, цэвэр агаар, тав тухтай орчин, тансаг, давтагдшгүй өнгө төрх, таныг илэрхийлэх төгс хийцлэлтэй King Tower 5 дугаар элчин орон сууцны загварын байранда та бүхнийг урьж байна. King Tower Apartment.
Good evening.
Good evening. Very nice to be here. Good to see you.
You have been an ambassador here, longest serving ambassador, almost 5 years, and you have been witnessing great events, I would say, historic events, not only in between two countries' relations, but also in the history of your country, which does not happen very often. So let's start, since you are now returning back, what will be the highlights of the relations between these two countries during your tenure?
Yeah, well, I would say there are really sort of two big areas where our collaboration has really increased in recent years. Firstly, our economic relationship has deepened and widened, and then our approach to democratic values and support for the rules-based international system. I think that has also strengthened. We've had a number of visits in both directions, of course. And the most prominent being His Excellency President Hulsuk's visit just recently for the coronation of His Majesty King Charles, and then just a few months previously, Prime Minister who visited for the state funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. So there's been a number of things that have been happening over the years during my time here, and I think also Mongolia itself has shifted quite significantly politically and economically. So it's been a really interesting time, and I feel privileged to have spent this time in Mongolia.
Well, let's then just start from the early days when we had first time. You are one of the first countries to recognize Mongolia and establish your embassy here.
Yeah.
And if you recall from this, what would we say, fundamental events in history?
Yeah, well, firstly, we're very proud of the fact that we were the very first Western country to establish relations with Mongolia back in 1963. And of course the world was rather different then. We were in the midst of the Cold War. Mongolia had only recently joined the United Nations at that point. And that was what prompted the UK's decision to establish relations. And I think probably in the first 30 years we had a number of we have very good relations, but obviously they were limited to some extent because of the Cold War situation. But we established a number of agreements around education, cultural exchanges, and so on. But I would say it was really since the early 1990s where the relationship has really strengthened following Mongolia's democratic revolution. We supported a lot in the early days after Mongolia became a democracy. And since then, things have sort of gone from strength to strength.
What was that, moving point or driving point for the UK to have a diplomatic relations before than anybody else. Does it say about the deeper historic relations, study, culture? Why would you think it happened in that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'd had a number of contacts with Mongolia over many centuries, even going back to the days of the Great Mongol Empire, and we had a lot of travellers who visited Mongolia from about the 17th century onwards. So there were some initial contacts. And I think after the Second World War, after all the various changes that took place after that, and then Mongolia joining the United Nations, I think that was the turning point, because at that point, the UK, we felt, well, we normally have relations with all members of the United Nations. Mongolia had joined, so it made sense to do so, and we looked at it both from a perspective of Mongolia's location between China and Russia, and also sort of for any potential future opportunities.
Still, the location is not changed.
That's not changed. That's not changed.
And
no.
it is making a great factor, of course, for our everyday action, I would say.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about economic. You said very wide and deep economic relations. What is the turnover of trade and what we are trading in between us, and what are the potential we can increase that?
Yeah. So in recent years, we've been seeing figures of around about £300 million in the bilateral trade relationship, and it sort of varies. Sometimes there are more exports towards the UK, sometimes more UK exports to Mongolia. It kind of varies.
What do we export from Mongolia to UK?
So the biggest sector is cashmere products. There is also some gold that is exported to the UK, primarily for reserve holdings that Mongolia has at the Bank of England.
Well, I understand they mostly sell to Switzerland.
Yeah, it has been changing a bit in recent years. There was a period when the UK was receiving most of the gold. It has changed a little bit in recent years.
What do we import from the UK?
So there's vehicles, machinery, some pharmaceutical products. There's a lot of goods relating to the mining sector. So we have companies like Cummins that make these huge diesel engines in the mining sector. Pandrol, who make fastenings for railways, they've been exporting a lot to Mongolia. Motor vehicles like Jaguar Land Rover.
Yes.
So there's a number of different areas of exports into Mongolia.
What is in terms of foreign direct investment from UK to Mongolia?
Well, the largest part of that, of course, is the Rio Tinto investment in Oyu-Tolgoi, and as you know, Rio is a joint UK-Australian company. It's headquartered in London. It's listed on the stock exchange in London, and the total investment in OT is running at about $15 billion US. So it's actually the largest single investment of any kind in Mongolia. And I think it's also significant as an investment from a third neighbour. So in recent years we've averaged around 10 or 12, and this year we'll be looking up to around maybe 18, something like that.
Oh, okay, so that means, it's for many years. It's gone on almost 20 years or so.
Yes, certainly well over 200 scholars or alumni.
And plus the Mongolians, those who pay themselves, they go and they also find their own scholarship too, right?
Indeed, yes.
Yes. Do you have any statistics how many Mongolians have graduated from the UK universities and colleges?
Yeah, that's harder to estimate because we don't sort of keep statistics as such. Every year we usually see around about, and this is based on the student visas that are issued, around about 400 go to the UK each year, roughly.
Wow.
So yes, obviously that would suggest there's quite a large number of Mongolians who've studied in the UK. And also this year, for the first time, the Mongolian President's Scholarship Scheme has sent, there are 28 Mongolian students studying in the UK under the President's Scholarship Scheme as well.
Mongolian President
yes,
Scholarship.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, that is a substantial investment in human capital.
It is, and I think one of the things that's always struck me about my time here in Mongolia is just how well educated people are in Mongolia, very high literacy rates, but also there's a real motivation for improving the education levels and attending universities in different countries.
Ambassador, you have been serving foreign service in many countries, I saw in your CV. And obviously there are, English being the leading language now of science, communication, diplomacy in the world. How do you find yourself the penetration of the language to Mongolian society?
I think it's you can probably see it's sort of split into two halves, perhaps. Maybe the younger generation, I would say, it's quite high penetration. Maybe the older generation who were exposed to other languages in the past maybe less so. But it's definitely increasing, and I know the government is now working on a policy to designate English effectively as a second language and to start.
And the official foreign language,
and the official
foreign language and the second language in the country.
Cambridge originally started with their program here around about 10 years ago. And there have been various different phases of the program. They've just recently started a new phase of that program, and it's focused around reforming the curriculum within the Mongolian state system, supporting capacity building of teachers, and all designed to try to improve the general standard of the curriculum and education right across the whole country. As you know, there are also some Cambridge schools here. Some of them are private, and there are 3 state schools which run the Cambridge program, and I think that also helps to develop the kind of an international standard of education.
You are from the country where the public and private schools have been established a long time ago, and a very serious background of education in the country. How do you see the combination of private and public school system in Mongolia? How do you find it?
Yeah, I think one challenge certainly is funding of the public education system. And again, I think this is something the government has been addressing for a number of years to increase the funding in the system so that there's equal opportunities of education right across the country. One big challenge of Mongolia, of course, is its size and having schools right across the country in some of the small sooms and towns. So that's a challenge to reach that. And I can see why there's private education providers who see an opportunity in the market to provide tuition to those families that can afford it. And in a way, that's sort of how it developed in the UK as well. Well, certainly, IT is definitely one area that needs to be enhanced, simply because of the technology of the world that we're now living in, and all of the children now will grow up in a very different way to certainly how I did when I was going through schooling. So that's definitely part of it. I think another area are the sort of sciences, or the so-called STEM subjects, so science, technology, mathematics. I think those are really important subjects to focus on. And foreign language capability, English in particular, because it is, as you said earlier, it is the global language. I think the key thing is to make sure that the standards are the same no matter where you go. Whichever school you go to, it has exactly the same standards, and that then helps raise the standards right across the board in math, science, language, and so on.
Let's say a bit about another value, that is democracy, human rights, rule of laws. And Mongolia, unlike some other neighbor countries, we go in that directions in the right way, but with a lot of difficulties. How do you find that? How do you see that? Where we you see we need to improve?
Well, I think first of all, I'm full of admiration for Mongolia for having taken that step at the end of the 1980s to decide that it wanted to pursue a democratic path, and I think that's because it's very much within the Mongolian psyche. I think the way that Mongolians see the world, I think their values are very much aligned with democratic values. But it's been difficult to transition from the former sort of centrally controlled single-party state. And I think Mongolia has made a lot of progress in the last 30 years, and it's continuing to make progress. Each consecutive government has done what it can to try to improve the democratic situation. And certainly when you look at the parliamentary side, elections, I mean that has been functioning very well, having elections every 4 years, sometimes changing governments, so that's a very good sign. I think there are still challenges around the judiciary, particularly the rule of law, as you mentioned. The concept or the idea of nobody being above the law. I think that's something that does need developing. And as we know, there are some challenges around the business environment as well, whether it's related to corruption or some of the governance issues, that things are not managed as well as they probably should be. So there are still some challenges, but I always do think, in fairness to Mongolia, to transition from a former Soviet communist system does take time, and it can't be done overnight.
Recently, this CPI, Corruption Perception Index, we are going back several places backward. It is not because corruption is more active now. It is because we are more disclosing these lot corrupt cases. Yeah. In particular, the current government, the Prime Minister, there have been several initiatives, as you see, 5-ish, maybe you already know.
Yes.
And bringing back asset recovery, etc., many things. In that regard, in terms of our judicial system to be improved, as you have just now mentioned, what is the relation in that field between UK and Mongolian judiciary systems?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an area where we could do more. I think I know through our Chevningg scholarship scheme, we've had some people who've studied law over the years as well. So, but I think there is something more we can do in that area to try to showcase the way the system works in the UK, particularly to judges and prosecutors, so that they can see precisely how an independent judicial system works. So that's definitely an area that I think we should try and do what we can in that area. And as you just said, the current government is making very good progress in terms of addressing the corruption issues through the current programme, and I totally agree with you that the drop in Mongolia's ranking in the Transparency Index is simply because there's more information out there now about these corruption cases and how the government is trying to address them.
Another field, I thought, in the strengthening the rules of law in Mongolia is your general election. You call it electorate committee.
Yes.
And we call it here general election committee, where mostly politicians or former politicians come to the. Unlike your electorate system, where mostly the voters are represented.
Yeah.
Mostly people through well-recognized socialite people are represented. We have been talking it before. What would we do in this regard?
Yes, indeed it is. Our parties they're not funded centrally. They raise their own funds, but there are very, very clear rules around how they can do that, and the importance of disclosure and transparency around the funds that they receive. Just so it's very clear that that it's very clear from where the money's coming, and so people understand any particular connections. And
a few words about BBC. And BBC, we are Mongolians who speaks English are lucky to receive that. You can catch the BBC in your car, etc. But there were times, sometimes it was off for a certain time and on. And how does it technically work? What we can do for making sure that this BBC is going in English in Mongolia, and one day maybe in Mongolian.
Yes, no, that's also.
It's already almost 27 or 30 foreign languages the BBC broadcasts.
Yes, indeed it does, including in this region. In Korean, for example, is one of the languages in this immediate region. I think the transmission of the radio service has been running actually very well. I recall in my first year it went off air because there were some sort of technical issues because the BBC changed the way that it was supplying the radio service. So the local broadcaster here needed to get some new equipment and change some things, but then that was resolved, and since then it's been running consistently, and I'm sure that will continue because the BBC has been working quite closely with the local broadcaster here just to ensure they can continue providing the service, and of course we also have the television world service which is provided by the local cable.
Television is doing very well, I think. Okay, a few words about the current British situation, UK situation in particular. You have made the so-called Brexit. You left European Union. And how is the situation to date? Was it what you were expecting? I know that they split the voice, but in general, are people sorry about that, or are people happy about that today?
I would say now, I think while there was quite a division around staying in the EU or leaving, I would say now that we're a few years down the line that I think people generally have come to terms with it, particularly those who maybe voted to remain in the European Union. I think people's focus now is much more on the immediate challenges of the economy, and the UK, like many other countries, has been suffering from the sort of post-pandemic recovery and also the impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has impacted particularly on energy prices. So, like many countries, the UK is facing slow growth and high inflation, and that's what the government is really focused on to improve growth and bring down inflation. And we had a recent budget where our finance minister introduced some measures to support the labour market, increase educational skills, supporting businesses to help them run their businesses. And I think we're looking probably maybe this year it'll be fairly flat growth, but 24, 25 we're looking to return to a more normal level of growth for the UK. But I think and when it comes to Brexit, the government was very, very clear that we wanted to minimise the impacts of leaving the European Union, and of course we achieved a trade and cooperation agreement which maintained trade between the UK and in the EU and investment between the two sides. And we've also been able to negotiate a lot of our own free trade agreements with many, many countries around the world, and just recently we joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP as it's called, and it's one of the largest free trade blocs in the world. So there have been advantages to leaving the EU in terms of being able to negotiate our own trade agreements around the world. So I think once we see the impacts of the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine slowly dropping away, we'll start to see more growth in the economy.
Okay. Another issue I think interesting for Mongolians is like situation today. For example, you have a Indian origin prime minister, and Indian companies, your former colonies, origin people, now Indian companies bought your Jaguar, Defender, all this. How all this being reflected in general public? Are they unhappy, happy, or what is I'm seeing that from Mongolian prism,
Yeah. Well, Britain has been developing as a sort of multicultural country for a number of years now, probably starting in the post-war period where we had a lot of people came into the UK from from the former colonies to help rebuild the UK after the Second World War. And I would say today it's become very much a part of everyday life. And as you said, we have a Prime Minister now who's of Indian origin, the First Minister of Scotland, also the Mayor of London. And I think it's just an illustration of the diversity and multiculturalism of the UK. And I would say people, generally speaking, are pretty comfortable with that because it's something they come across every single day. But yes, certainly the UK is different today compared to, say, 50 years ago.
All right, my final question around Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, Mongolian official positions. People, it's a free country. People have different opinions. They express, some go to Russian embassy to demonstrate, some go to square, etc. How do you find the Mongolian kind of going through all this thing, obviously having all this peculiarities of the relations with our neighbor countries? Yeah. How do you find as ambassador, as a European, the relations, foreign stand of Mongolia?
I think it's fully understandable, the position that Mongolia has taken, because it does have important dependencies on Russia, and which you could even describe as vulnerabilities, so energy supplies and so on, and other trading. So, and there is the longer-term historic relationship as well. So I think it is challenging for Mongolia to stand up and maybe criticise Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, the fact that Mongolia has abstained on the various UN resolutions also sends a message, because it also says that Mongolia is if you like rather unhappy with that situation, and is joining the vast majority of countries in the world who feel that what Russia has done in Ukraine is completely wrong, and without any justification or reason. But it's difficult for Mongolia. It needs to maintain good relations with its northern neighbour, and as we said at the start, Mongolia will always have Russia as its neighbour, so it needs to keep that in consideration.
The final question, you may not answer too, but how do you see the end of the war there? In which way?
Gosh, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think the most important thing, and that this is behind the policy of the UK and other partners, is to help Ukraine to win this war and to be able to stop the Russian invasion and push them back into Russia. I think that's what we all want to see, so that the Ukraine can then regain and return to being a country that's not under this kind of under this sort of situation.
So pity to see thousands, even hundreds of thousands of young people on two sides killed. This is very terrible to see that. I mean, that's tough. Anyway,
it is.
Ambassador, thank you very much for having this very extended conversation. I thought it is important for having further development of our relations, not only between the states, but also ordinary people. And you have been always great ambassador. You have been participating in many, not only government, but a lot non-state organizations, events, even including my de facto party event.
Indeed, yes.
I enjoyed your friendship, and I would like to wish all success in your future life.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all continued success as well. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
За, хүнд үзэгчтэй өнөөдөр манай de facto ярилцлагын сэдвээр та бүхэн Их Британи, Умард Ирландын нэгдсэн хаант улсын болон цог жавхланд хааны бие төлөөлөгч онц бөгөөд бүрэн эрхт элчин сайд Филип Малонтой уулзлаа. Баярлалаа.